Morning. A sterile briefing room at a high-security Air Force base. A sea of flight suits and heavy brass pilots and tactical officers gather for a high-stakes training evaluation. In the back row stands a new officer, quiet, unassuming. Most think she's just a fresh transfer in a support role. The meeting begins. A 3-star general enters, eyes scanning the roster. He stops at her name. He looks up, his gaze piercing the room. He asks one short question. Your call, sign. She answers calmly, SPECTER SIX. The room freezes instantly. The silence is absolute. Watch her listen now. Believe in the ghost who knows. Stand by. Captain Elena Voss was a ghost in a world of high-decibel egos. At 31, she possessed a face that revealed nothing, a map of absolute discipline, and eyes that seemed to have seen the horizon and decided it wasn't worth talking about. She had arrived at the 48th Fighter Wing only 48 hours ago. In the hangar, amidst the roar of twin engines and the sharp acidic smell of JP-8 fuel, she was just another uniform. Her service jacket was clean, her posture perfect, but she carried no flashy patches, no combat ribbons on her flight suit, and no stories to trade over coffee in the ready room. The hangar at dawn was a cathedral of aluminum and titanium. The morning light filtered through the high windows, catching the dust motes dancing around the sharp edges of F-35 Lightnings. To the elite pilots of the Wolfpack Squadron, Elena was a variable they didn't care to solve. They saw a woman who stood alone near the service racks, checking her flight gear with a clinical, repetitive focus that seemed almost robotic. Major Cutter Vance, a pilot with 1,000 hours and a mouth to match, had already labeled her during the morning pre-flight. He leaned against the wing of his jet, smirking as he watched Elena methodically inspect her helmet's oxygen seal, checking the pressure valves with a rhythmic efficiency that most pilots left to the ground crew. Look at the new transfer, Vance whispered to his wingman, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Quiet as a mouse. She probably spent her career as a logistics liaison or a weather officer in a bunker. Doesn't look like she's ever pulled more than 4 GS in her life. Probably here to fill a slot in the administrative rotation. They send us the quiet ones when they want the paperwork done on time. The consensus in the room was swift and judgmental. They lived in a culture where reputation was shouted from the rooftops. In the Wolf Pack, if you hadn't downed a target in a red flag exercise or let a multi-ship strike into a simulated dead zone, you were background noise. Elena didn't help her own case. She moved through the quarters like a shadow, avoiding the cafeteria banter and the post-shift bravado. When a senior captain asked her where she had been assigned previously, she simply replied, different assignment, sir, and went back to her checklist. She didn't mention missions, she didn't mention flight hours, she didn't even give them a nickname to call her by. She's a ghost, someone remarked during the afternoon debrief, and in this business if no one knows your name it's because you haven't done anything worth remembering. They assumed her vague answers were a cover for a lack of real-world experience. They saw her silence as a sign of a support role, someone meant to handle the data entry and paperwork, while the real pilots handled the sky. They didn't see the way her hands never shook, even when a heavy transport roared just yards away, or the way her eyes scanned the room with a tactical precision that should have made their hair stand up. Even the mechanics noticed her. One master sergeant, a man who had been turning wrenches since the Gulf War, watched her walk past the engines. He noticed that she didn't look at the sleek fuselage or the polished glass. She looked at the rivets, she looked at the heat shielding on the exhaust nozzles, she looked at the parts that failed first. He mentioned it to Vance, but the major just laughed it off. She's probably looking for her reflection, Sergeant. Don't overthink it. The briefing room was a pressurized chamber of ambition. As the pilots waited for the evaluation to begin, they jockeyed for position, talking about their kills in the simulator and their heroics in the last joint exercise. Elena stayed in the back, leaning against the cold metal wall, almost blending into the shadows. She was content with her invisibility. She knew that in the military, as in life, the loudest people are usually the ones with the most to prove, and Elena Voss had nothing left to prove to anyone who wasn't currently in the cockpit beside her. She had lived a life of secrets where name was more than a label. It was a key to a vault of history that most of these men couldn't even imagine. If you think people are judged too quickly, comment that's so unfair. The heavy double doors of the briefing room swung open, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. General Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation for crushing incompetence was only surpassed by his legendary demands for perfection, marched to the front. He wasn't there for a pep talk. This was a Tier 1 evaluation for a joint strike mission simulation, a complex multi-unit exercise that required the kind of split-second coordination that most teams took years to master. The room went silent, the kind of silence that usually preceded a storm. Thorne began assigning roles for the simulation. He picked the lead pilots, the tactical coordinators, and the electronic warfare specialist. He moved through the names with a surgical coldness, dismissing anyone who hesitated for even a second. Major Vance was given the lead for the primary strike group. He puffed out his chest, glancing back at Elena with a look that said, watch how the pros do it, rookie. He assumed she would be assigned to the eyes and ears group, the support staff who sat in the back of an AWACS plane far from the line of fire. But as the general reached the end of the list, he paused. He opened a separate folder, one marked with a red stripe that indicated a higher level of clearance. He looked at the file for the newest arrival, Captain Elena Voss. His brow furrowed. He looked at the seat in the back row where Elena was standing. The general had served for 35 years. He had seen thousands of pilots, but something about the way Elena stood, unblinking, steady, and entirely unfazed by the predatory energy in the room, triggered a deep dormant memory. He remembered a day in the Mojave 15 years ago, watching a pilot pull a maneuver that defied the flight computer safety limiters. He remembered the name associated with that Specific lethal grace. Captain Voss, the general, said, his voice a low vibration that made the junior officers sit up straighter. Sir Elena replied, her voice steady as her horizon line. Your file is remarkably sparse on combat details. Thorne noted, his eyes narrowing. It mentions several redacted assignments over the last 4 years in a training exercise of this complexity where we are simulating an integrated defense breach. We can't afford a weak link in the chain. I need to know your operational history. Who did you fly with? What was your primary focus? Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't look for an excuse or try to fluff her resume. I was attached to various joint task force units, so usually in a high-threat environment suppression and extraction role. My primary focus was gap-filling. When the standard protocols failed, I was the person you sent when the radar went dark. The pilots in the front row snickered. Suppression role, that's a fancy way of saying she stayed in the back and watched the radar. Major Vance whispered to his neighbor. The laughter was low, but it rippled through the front seats like a wave. The general didn't laugh. He kept staring at her. He remembered a debrief from a classified rescue mission in the Hindu Kush 3 years ago, a mission that had officially never happened. The report had mentioned a SPECTER unit that had held a quarter open for 6 hours against a full-scale insurgent anti-air battery flying a disabled gunship through a canyon that was only 50 feet wider than the wings. The lead pilot of that unit had been a legend in the special operations community, someone who didn't exist on paper but lived in the nightmares of their enemies. Your call sign, Captain, the general demanded. It wasn't a casual request in the military. A call sign isn't just a nickname, it's a legacy. It carries the weight of every mission, every mistake, and every life saved. It is the name you use when the world is burning, and you are the only one left to put it out. Elena took a breath. The room went into a vacuum of sound. She looked the general directly in the eye, her expression unchanging, her voice carrying a frequency that seemed to cut through the very SPECTER SIX, so the effect was instantaneous. The general's hands, which had been resting on the podium, gripped the edges until his knuckles turned white. 2 senior colonels in the front row stood up instinctively, their chairs screeching against the floor like a scream. A veteran pilot near the window who had been lazily spinning a pen dropped it. It hit the floor with a tiny echoing clack that sounded like a gunshot in the total silence. Major Vance's smirk didn't just fade, it evaporated. He looked as if someone had just told him the sky was falling. The name SPECTER SIX didn't just carry history, it carried a terrifying gravity. It was a name that had appeared in the most classified after-action reports of the decade. It belonged to the pilot who had navigated a disabled transport through a mountain pass in a blinding snowstorm to save a stranded platoon. It belonged to the officer who had led a 4-ship team into a dead zone to extract a downed SEAL team when everyone else said it was a suicide mission. The pilots who had been mocking her just seconds ago were now staring at her as if she had just grown a pair of wings. The atmosphere in the room didn't just change, it solidified into a heavy respectful. Or they realized then that the quiet transfer wasn't a support officer or a rookie liaison. She was the person they had been studying in their advanced tactical manuals for 3 years. She was the ghost who had held the door open while the rest of the world escaped. If you realize some names carry history. Comment, I was wrong. The briefing room felt like it had been emptied of oxygen. Every eye was locked on Elena. The mockery that had permeated the air for the last hour was replaced by a suffocating sense of disbelief. Major Vance, whose ego had been the largest thing in the room, now looked like a man who had just insulted a god and was waiting for the lightning bolt to strike. He looked at Elena's flight suit, the one he had mocked for being too clean, and realized that the lack of patches wasn't because she hadn't earned them, it was because the unit she served with weren't allowed to have them. They operated in the black where identities were erased for the sake of the mission. SPECTER SIX, the general repeated, his voice hushed with a rare genuine reverence. He turned to the officers in the room. For those of you who are too young to know the logs, let me clarify. SPECTER isn't just a squadron, it's a special operations designation for pilots who operate outside the standard chain of command when the mission parameters are deemed impossible or non-survivable, and 6-6 is the lead, the one who makes the calls, the one who brings the team home when everyone else is already writing the obituaries. In the last 10 years, only 4 pilots have held that designation. 2 are dead, 1 is retired, and the 4th. He looked directly at Elena. The 4th was the architect of the deep strike in 2021. The general looked back at Elena. The report from Operation Crimson Shadow mentioned a pilot who stayed in the kill box for 40 minutes with a burning engine and a shattered canopy just to keep the extract helicopters covered from ground fire. The report said that pilot didn't want a medal. The report said that pilot simply wanted her crew's names on the board. First was that you boss. Elena didn't look proud, she didn't look triumphant, she looked weary, as if the memory itself carried a physical weight. I was just the one holding the line, sir. It was a team effort. The ground crew did the real work. If the JTAC hadn't stayed on the radio, we wouldn't have found the hole in the clouds. A veteran pilot in the second row, a man named Colonel Graham, stood up slowly. He had a jagged scar running down his cheek and 3 combat tours under his belt. He was the kind of man who never spoke unless it was necessary. He looked at Elena with an expression that was almost pained. I was on the ground during Crimson Shadow, Graham said, his voice raspy and full of an emotion that the younger pilots had never heard from him. I was the JTA. C calling for air support when the mountains started screaming with lead. We were pinned down out of water, and we had 3 casualties. I heard a voice on the radio, calm, clear, almost bored, telling us to stay low. While she cleaned the house, she flew so low the heat from her engines melted the snow on our position. We thought it was an angel with a Gatling gun. I've spent 3 years wondering whose voice that was. I owe you my life, Captain, my entire team. Does the colonel didn't salute. He simply bowed his head, a gesture of respect that carried more weight in that room than any formal protocol. The revelation hit the younger pilots like a physical blow. They realized that Elena Voss wasn't new. She was the person they had been trying to emulate in their training simulations. She was the one who had written the unwritten rules of modern close air support. She had navigated through situations they only saw in movies, and she had done it without ever asking for a single headline or a promotion. Her silence wasn't a lack of experience, it was a lack of need for validation. Why didn't you say anything, Major Vance? Asked, his voice now small and full of a burning genuine shame. We were treating you like a rookie. I said things, I mocked your gear, I called you a liaison, I even suggested you were here for the administrative rotation. Elena turned her gaze toward him. There was no anger in her eyes, no desire for revenge, just a quiet, unshakable integrity in the cockpit. Major, your resume doesn't fly the plane, your ego doesn't pull the trigger. We are only as good as the mission we are currently on. I didn't come here to be Spectre 6, I came here to be a pilot in your wing. My past is just data. Your mission today is the only thing that matters. If you're focused on my reputation, you're not focused on the radar. The sky doesn't care who you were 3 years ago. The general nodded slowly, closing the folder on the podium. He realized that Elena's sparse record wasn't because she lacked experience. It was because her experience was so sensitive it could never be made public. She had been Spectre 6 because she was the only one who could operate in the dark, and she was here now because she wanted a life where she didn't have to be a ghost anymore. Captain Voss, the general said, his tone final and absolute, you will be the mission commander for this exercise. Major Vance, you will be her wingman. You might actually learn something about what it means to lead a team without making a sound. The rest of you take a good look at that uniform. That's what a hero looks like when they aren't looking for a camera. Dismissed to the hangar. Major Vance didn't argue. He didn't even blink. He simply stood up and offered the sharpest salute of his entire career. Yes, sir. The room began to clear, but no one was talking about their kills or their stats anymore. They were walking out in a heavy silence, following the woman they had spent the morning ignoring. Elena Voss walked toward the hangar, her helmet under her arm, her pace steady and humble. She didn't look like a legend, she just looked like a pilot going to work. But as she passed the service crew, they didn't just nod, they stood at attention. They knew the Spectre was back. If you believe real reputation is built in silence. Comment, I am in debt. The training exercise lasted for 4 grueling hours. It was the most disciplined, precise and effective session the Wolfpack Squadron had ever recorded in its history. There was no chatter on the comms, no one tried to be a hero. They moved like a single organism, a school of predatory fish, guided by the calm, rhythmic voice of Elena Voss. Whenever a situation got chaotic, whenever the simulated radar went blind or the enemy SAMs locked on, Elena was there providing the coordinates and the exit path before the computer could even calculate them. She